Welcome to the NewSpace India podcast, a bi-weekly talk show that brings you exclusive stories from people driving India's space activities. The NewSpace India podcast is pleased to announce our association with Dassault Systems, a global leader in providing businesses and people with collaborative virtual environments to imagine sustainable innovations. Dassault Systems solutions support startups, small and medium-scale enterprises, and original equipment manufacturers in developing disruptive solutions for space launchers and satellite propulsion. Hi, and welcome to yet another episode of the NewSpace India podcast. Today we have here Nirupesh, who's one of the co-founders of the Bangalore Watch Company, whose promotion video I watched on YouTube, and I was really impressed, and I thought I should definitely meet him when I'm here in Bangalore and record an episode. So Nirupesh, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me here, Narayan. It's wonderful to be actually in a space podcast talking about space stuff. So it's really exciting.
Great. So first we'll probably get to your own background a little bit before we actually talk about, Bangalore Watch Company and all the space related things. I saw that you have a very interesting background as well, doing stuff in technology, electronics industry, I guess, and then stepping into what you are doing now. So are you a kind of a childhood, watch enthusiast who happened to then realize whatever you wanted to do later in the career?
A great question. It's a good segue. Unlike many watch brand owners who would tell you that they had a grandfather's watch that was handed down to them that became an inspiration to start a watch company, I had nothing like that in my past. I was actually a science buff when I was young. I was a huge science fiction buff. I grew up watching the Aliens. I grew up watching any space movie. I grew up reading a lot of Michael Crichton. So I'm a huge space buff. I had nothing to do with watches in my younger years. I had nothing to do with watches. Watches actually came much later in life.
So, carry on probably talking about, I saw that you, were working in the electronics industry for like probably 10 years or so. So what was the career moves that led to starting the Bangalore Watch Company?
Yeah, I spent about 17 years in tech, actually, across multiple companies. Started with Microsoft and then moved on to a VoIP and SIP in the telecommunications space. And then I moved on to the cloud security and content delivery space with a Boston MIT-based company called Akamai. That's where I spent a majority of my time there, almost 11 years, starting with their technical consulting team, helping their customers build internet infrastructure worldwide, and going on to build technical consulting teams for them all around the world, in the US, in India, and in the Far East. And that gave me and my wife, Mercy, the opportunity to travel and see the world. So we've been in Bangalore for almost 20 years now. We've called Bangalore home, but we've had the opportunity to move in and out of Bangalore over the last 20-year time frame. So we moved back and forth between the city and outside. But yeah, a lot of the time, as far as the career is concerned, is in the technology space, building technical consulting teams, building new businesses in technical consulting for cloud security company.
Great. And, what was the point in which you said that, okay, I'm going to quit all of this and start a watch startup?
Yeah, a movie would make that scene like an overnight thing, but it was not a movie, so it was absolutely not an overnight decision. My wife and I we were doing very well. We were traveling the world. Like many other people, we had the good fortune of, we had decent paychecks. We were living in Hong Kong at that time. We had lived there for a couple of years at that time. And for like a lot of people, we also had the good fortune of being able to afford some nice watches when we lived in Hong Kong. If you've ever been to Hong Kong, just like Dubai, Hong Kong's a fantastic place if you want to explore wristwatches, and serious wristwatches at that. And that's how the exposure to wristwatches started. Very late, although in a fantastic place with lots of exposure. But then again, personally, both Mercy, my wife Mercy, and I, we felt that we were moving every 2 years, and we stopped and asked a question. Look, we've done this for 15 years. Is this how we want the next 15 years of our lives to be? We took a sabbatical for 6 months. We traveled the Trans-Siberian train. We went from Beijing all the way to St. Petersburg on the train. We asked a lot of big questions about what we want to do in life. And at the end of that journey, we made the decision to leave our jobs and move back to India to do something on our own. That was the thought process. Let's do something on our own, because both my wife and I, we've been together for a long time. We met at university. We can play to each other's strengths, but we were not working together. She was in a different job. I was in a different job. So we wanted to do something together, and we wanted to be back home in Bangalore. There were multiple options, and one of those options was to start a watch company, a boutique watch brand in India. So it was not Narayan, an overnight decision, but a decision that we pondered for a while before we made that.
Right. It's also, fairly large shift from being a watch enthusiast to starting a watch company as such. I wonder, what that is, because at the end of the day, you need to be really passionate about investing all the time, effort, money, everything else that you have in your passion, and you need to make sure that that passion sustains for you to then make money outside on the other side, right? So how much of the technicalities of watches, because you come from a let's say software technology background, watches are more into design, they're more into, let's say, the technology behind watches may be very different, and so I'm sure that you have to learn a lot of these things, right? So tell us a little bit about this process of thinking about being a watch enthusiast to saying, I know everything about watches and I know what I'm going to be building.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fantastic question. Not a lot of people ask us that question, because I don't believe that not a lot of people think in that direction. But it's a great question. Look, not all watch enthusiasts can be watch business owners or watch brand owners. I'd also like to, for everybody that's listening, my wife and I, we are watch brand owners. We're not qualified watchmakers. There's a big difference between the two. A lot of people come to us and ask us, so how long does it take for you to make one watch, right? I think they're mistaken that they think that we make these watches ourselves. We're not watchmakers. Watchmaking is a separate skill. We employ watchmakers in our brand, but my wife and I, we're not watchmakers ourselves. We're watch brand owners. There's a clear distinction between the two. And as a brand owner, you need to have very specific, you must have a vision for any brand owner, not just a watch brand owner, and you must have very specific skills in order to start a watch brand. And those skills are something that we built over a period of time. We're still building. We just celebrated our third year anniversary as a brand. We have a long way to go. If you look at the history of watch brands all around the world, the 100-year-old, 150-year-old watch brands around. So we have a long journey to go. But we've learned a lot through this process over the last 3 to 4 years as we've been in pursuit for this. So yeah, we're on that journey now.
Great. And again, it was very interesting that you mentioned that watchmakers are commissioned by brands and then you pick them, all of this. I'm sure that is also a learning process as to which watch manufacturer you have to go to. Is it from India? Is it from somewhere else, and all of this? Can you give a background on how this thing works at the industry level for somebody to then come up and say, I'm going to build a watch brand?
Oh, great question. The notion about watchmaking in general, and thanks to Swiss watches and Swiss watch marketing, is the belief that there's an elderly watchmaker hunched over a workbench putting together watches somewhere in a cottage in Le Loc in Switzerland. But the reality of watchmaking today, for a lot of the luxury brands, is that watch manufacturing today is an industrialized process which is not very different from the automotive industry today. For example, if you're driving a car today, you need to understand that the car was put together by the brand that owns the car, but the windshield of that car, for instance, was manufactured by a specialist windshield manufacturer, which is called OEM in the industry speak, original equipment manufacturing. The OEM makes windshields for 100 different brands, and this car brand that you're driving chose to buy windshield from this OEM. And the same way they chose to buy the door locks from another OEM, they chose to buy the alloy wheels from another OEM. So it all comes from specialized manufacturers who specialize in specific components, and the whole car is put together in an assembly line that's owned by the brand and operated by the brand. In the same way, watch manufacturing works the same today. A watch brand owns the IP, the design, the engineering, the construction, and then those designs are handed off to OEMs that produce to the watch brand's specifications, and the whole thing comes back together and the brand puts it together and then chooses to market it and sell it. And we operate in the same fashion. So today, Bangalore Watch Company, we design, engineer our watches in Bangalore. We work with OEMs and manufacturers who are both in India and overseas, depending on who we work with. And then we bring all the components back here to Bangalore in our facility to do the final assembly, the QC. So every watch that leaves from here, is assembled and tested in our facility.
Right, and when you talk about the watch design, I guess it's the conception of what it will look like, the materials. What do you really mean when you say that we own like the design bit of it?
So I'd like to take a step back. We want to look at what Bangalore Watch Company stands for before we talk about what is it that we design and why we design things a certain way. So remember I talked about how we were in Hong Kong and we were exposed to the world of wristwatches. This was the time in 2013 when HMT, it was announced that the government of India was going to pull the plug on HMT and they were shutting down the watch division. And this is when we were exposed to a lot of the international watch brands in Hong Kong. There were a couple of things that stood out when we looked at all these watch brands. Number one is the watchmaking skill and with the attention to detail, the finesse with which luxury brands make their watches is no different from the jewelry industry in India. So if our jewelry industry can do excellent jewelry and world-class jewelry with the same attention to detail and the finesse, there was a question why the watchmaking industry did not flourish in the same way that the jewelry industry flourished in India. The second thing that stood out to us was that every watchmaker around the world had excellent watches with technical capability, also had wonderful stories, and that's what made the watches special. Let's take Omega, for instance, right? Omega as a watch brand has excellent stories behind their watches. They even have what's called as a moon watch. And those watches went to the moon several times on the wrists of astronauts for several NASA missions and also ESA missions. We have IWC, who's another luxury watchmaker, who have watches that have a lot of history, and they make watches that pay tribute to World War II airplanes. So these stories specifically are the ones that make the watches special, in addition to the technical complications of the watches themselves. This was the second thing that stood out to us. When we looked back to India, what we realized was that the watch market in India was bipolar in a way. You had a lot of accessible price point watches on the one end of the spectrum, brands like Titan or Fast Track or Timex. We have huge respect for what they do. They do some amazing watches and from a very respectable house like Tata Group. But it's very polar, right? I mean, on the one side you have this, and on the other hand you have the luxury watches. Any luxury brand that you can buy overseas, you can also buy in India right now. But what we realized was that there was room for a watch company to come in and make respectable quality watches in India, serious watches, automatic movements and whatnot, specifically with Indian backstories. We felt that it was missing. And if I may elaborate on that for a second, the grammar of Indian watch design was very colonial and outdated. If a luxury watch brand were to come in and make a India-inspired watch, they would either put Sanskrit numerals on the dial and call it an India limited edition watch, or they would put a Taj Mahal on the dial or the back of the watch and call it an India watch. And that quite didn't sit well with us. We felt that we grew up in India in the last 2 decades, and we're very proud of our origins and our background, and we see a very different India from the colonial view of India. So we felt that there was a gap in making respectable quality watches, which at the same time told very inspiring stories from India, our recent space watch being one of those. And that's the core of the brand, right? So now we'll talk about how we design and what do you mean by we design the watches. Every watch that we've put out in the last 3 years has an Indian backstory to it. We started with a dress watch. A dress watch is a very formal, simple, understated watch that pays tribute to HMT. So if you look at that dress watch, it looks like your HMT Janata, except that it's a 2020 version of the HMT. It's modern. It's got anti-scratch sapphire glass. It's got marine-grade stainless steel. It's got the highest quality components and with a lot of attention to detail. So it's a luxury watch inspired by mid-century India. The second collection that we put out was a pilot watch, an aviation-inspired watch that pays tribute to the Indian Air Force, specifically the first supersonic fighter plane of the Indian Air Force, the MiG-21 Type 77. I mean, people wonder why a MiG. Of course, the MiG's not Indian, but the MiG was built in India under license by HAL, and it was our first supersonic fighter plane. And then the third watch that we built was a sports watch that pays tribute to cricket. There's 1 billion of us that love cricket and play cricket, and more in other countries as well. So there was no reason we couldn't make a sports watch that's inspired by cricket. And most recently, we made yet another sports watch that pays tribute to the Indian space program, and we called it the Apogee. And I'm sure we'll talk about that. So every watch has an Indian backstory. So the design is very unique. It's very distinct. Like the Apogee watch has a very distinct design. It's got the Aryabhatta engraving on the case back. So all this design IP is ours. So we have a design team that puts it together with the first initial vision that they translate into design. And then the designs get translated into technical specifications of, okay, how heavy should the case be? Should it be grade 2 titanium or grade 5 titanium? CNC milling specifications. The whole engineering drawing gets done. And then we work with partners both in India and overseas to make these individual components that all then come back to Bangalore for final assembly.
Right, very interesting, and thanks for explaining a lot of those intricacies. I wanted to kind of double down on a few things there.
Of course.
One is, of course, you identified a very good niche, perhaps, of saying that a high-end Indian backstory brand doesn't exist in the country. And that's, I think, a niche in itself, and perhaps you'll probably have to go through the discovery process. Why not? And so just to kind of get a sense of a person who is, let's say, not into watches. Let's say I'm not a person that is hugely into watches. For a person like me, I would love to hear from you, what is the watch industry like in India, especially when it comes to, let's say, the entire low-end, mid-tier, high-end as such. And why do you think now is the time for something like the Apogee series to blossom?
Oh, it's a great question. Let's talk about the watch industry. It's a very simple thing. A majority of us don't really care about the type of watch we wear. We only care about what that watch looks like. That's the case with the majority of us, right? But then again, watches are something that you start paying attention to. It's no different from shoes. I know a lot of people that pay a lot of attention to the kind of shoes they wear. I know a lot of people that start paying attention to the kind of denims they wear. They'll only wear a certain kind of denims. Or maybe you'll only wear a certain kind of shirts, So watches are no different. It's an accessory. Make no mistake. None of us need a wristwatch today to tell us what time it is. Our microwave tells us what time it is. Our car clock tells us what time it is. Everything tells us what time it is. We only need wristwatches because there is an emotional connection with wristwatches over centuries that you just can't undo in your brain. There's a certain connection that goes, oh, this is my father's watch. He cherished it. He wore it for 50 years in a row. He worked day in, day out. And this watch is with me now. It got passed down to me. So there's an emotional connection with watches, be it your father's watch, be it your anniversary watch that your wife bought to you, or the one that you bought to your wife or husband. Or it could be a watch that you bought yourself in your first paycheck or a bonus. So there's a strong emotional connection with watches. Interestingly, culturally, not many other accessories have the same kind of emotional connection with humans. So watches play a role only in that sense that if you have an emotional connection with your watch, it becomes important to you. For the rest of us, for a vast majority of the folks, they only care about what that watch looks like, and does it look cool, and does it fit my wallet, for lack of a better word. So if you look at the Indian market, it's no different, right? You have the vast majority of watches being produced by Titan. You have Fast Track on the other hand, and you have a lot of other small brands. And then those are the watches that we start with. I started with the Titan. My first watch was a Titan. My parents bought me one, I think right after it was class 10 maybe, when I was entering like PU. They got me a nice Titan watch. I still remember what that watch looked like. I think Titan's it's a ubiquitous brand that everybody starts with in India. For folks that are listening from overseas, it could be your Swatch, right? Swatch is what everybody starts with overseas. And then specifically in India, people graduate from a Titan when probably they have their first jobs, or they're just getting out of university. Interestingly, they graduate to what I call a mall watch. A mall watch is when you walk into a shopping mall, you find these fashion labels that you're able to relate to. Like it could be Esprit, it could be Michael Kors, it could be Tommy Hilfiger. But interestingly, these watches look fashionable. They carry a fashion brand label on it, but they're not watchmakers' watches, right? They have fashion companies that also make watches in their labels. But interestingly, when we all graduate from a Titan watch, we move to a mall watch. After a while, you start looking at a more serious watch, and that's when you graduate from a mall watch to start looking at probably something more serious. This is when brands like Seiko, Tissot, Rado, Longines, these brands come in, and that's where we're placing ourselves. So if you look at where we're positioning ourselves, Bangalore Watch Company is squarely positioned when somebody's looking to upgrade from their mall watch to a first serious watch, or for somebody that's already buying multiple Swiss watches and they're looking at something more unique, more interesting, and for lack of a better word, an itch that the Swiss watch doesn't scratch, right? Which is your respectable quality watch from India with an Indian backstory that you could proudly wear, and it's understated too. It's not going to carry you're not carrying a logo. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Absolutely fascinating to hear, all of the details as such. So when it comes to, let's say the Apogee series itself, I mean, you mentioned that you went from HMT to, doing the sports one and so on, right? So why did you see that you have to do something on space?
Space is a very interesting area when it comes to watches, right? I mean, if you look at space and watches, they've been inseparable, right? Right from the first missions, NASA missions, especially human missions, you see watches that they're inseparable. Every story you read about a human space mission, be it NASA or ESA, or even the Roscosmos missions, right? You see watches coming in. It could be like a Raketa from a Russian watch, or a Vostok Russian watch, or an Omega watch, or a Bulova American watch. Watches have been inseparable. With the vision of Bangalore Watch Company being inspiring stories from India with a modern view, the story of the Indian space program is something that you can't ignore. When that's the vision, or rather that's your mission statement, is to make watches with Indian backstories, you can't ignore the Indian space program, especially what the Indian space program has been able to do in the last few decades, starting where it started. I mean, it's going to be very hard to imagine us, a motley crew of scientists that got together in Tumba sounding rockets not 50 years ago, is today a huge agency employing thousands of people and inspiring millions of people. And I think that's a story that has to be told through watches. And we were very sure about it right from day one. It was just a matter of time. We had to graduate, earn our stripes, and get to this point. But it was always part of the plan, is to do an Indian space watch. It just took us 3 years to get here, but I'm very happy and excited that we got here. So this story had to be told.
Right. And, why did you come up with the word like Apogee?
Yeah, I think this is a space podcast, so I should assume that everybody here, listeners and host inclusive, knows more about space than I do, although I'm a space buff. But the word apogee means that it's the farthest point in a satellite's orbit. And especially in orbit around Earth, I assume. And it's a farthest point also for Bangalore Watch Company in terms of what we've been able to do so far. We pushed ourselves to our farthest point with this project, be it the storytelling, be it the material selection of the watch, be it the construction and design of the watch, and also how the entire watch has come about. We believe that we've pushed ourselves to our farthest point. We've not gone this far since inception of our company So we found it very fitting to call it our Apogee. So we named it Apogee.
Right. Again, would love for you to describe what was the process in selecting, let's say, the Aryabhatta cover, or selecting the kind of colors that you've chosen, the kind of materials that I've chosen. So give us like the backstory behind the promotion video that you already have.
Sure. So for the uninitiated, the Apogee is a sports watch, but it's an automatic watch. What that means is that the mechanism inside does not require batteries. It's powered by a Swiss mechanism. You wear it on your wrist, it keeps going. It's almost a century-old technology that they've perfected very well, and it works perfectly. There's a level of romanticism involved in wearing something that doesn't need battery. We're in 2021 and it doesn't need battery. So the Apogee uses the Swiss mechanism. It's built. The case of the Apogee is built with a titanium body. It's grade 2 titanium as opposed to grade 5 titanium. It's also built with a unibody construction. Usually watch bodies, cases are built with 3 parts. There is a mid case, and then there's a case back cover and a bezel, as they call it. But here it's a unibody. It's one piece construction. The reason so first of all, starts with construction. We chose a unibody construction and a titanium material because at the end of the day, it's a space-themed watch, so it better be as relevant as possible. And we all know that sending every single kilogram up in space is a lot more expensive. So every kilogram you add to the payload is going to get more and more expensive. So lightness of materials is really important. And we all know that titanium is very commonly used for anything that has to do with anything that goes inside the payload. So we had to use titanium as well. We've used grade 2 titanium. We've also finished the titanium case in a micro bead blasted finishing. So that gives a very space age UFO-ish look to the case. If you look at it, it's dark, it's deceiving, it's got a very cool future space age look. So that was the reason to choose titanium to begin with. And the construction is unibody, so we could make it light. The entire case body is less than 40 grams. So super light in context of large, heavy, chunky watches that are made of stainless steel today. And of course, it comes with a reliable Swiss technology that would keep the watch going. You never ever need batteries. So that's the advantage there. The other interesting feature is the case back design, which is the Aryabhatta satellite's picture. That was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek approach when we took that. If you remember the 2 rupee Indian currency from back in the day, it had the Aryabhatta picture on it, orbiting Earth. So we wanted to, it's a bit of nostalgia. We want to remind people of that. So we put that engraving in the back. And we're also celebrating 50 years of the space program through this watch. And if you look at where the space program came of age, it was in the early 70s. And I think the Aryabhatta was the first step in that, where it was the first indigenously developed satellite, although not launched by us. It was launched from Russia, but it was our satellite for all intents and purposes. So it was very fitting to use the Aryabhatta on the back cover. The next interesting feature of that watch is that it has a dual time zone feature. So you can turn a ring inside the watch and you can simultaneously track a second time zone. The idea was to give a space traveler or an astronaut the option to know what time it is in mission control, right? It's a very, like I said, it's a very tongue-in-cheek approach of design, where we're saying, look, you need to know the local time. You also need to know what mission control time is. So you have a dual time tracking feature. And then the dial colors are very space inspired. We have a blue that we're calling the horizon. The idea is, what do you see from a low Earth orbit? You see the blue and black of the Earth's horizon, so we call it horizon. And then there is a bright green, which we're calling supernova, from the supernova explosions that we've seen. And then there is a gray, dark gray, which we're calling deep space. So I think the dial colors, the construction, how the whole watch came together is very fitting. And then, of course, there's a meteorite version that we did, which hopefully we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, look, I mean, the design, the construction, the presentation, it all comes together. It tells the story and also gives the wearer a very respectable watch that would work for 15, 20 years in the future with no need to, change any batteries at all.
Right. Again, super interesting with all the connection between the storylines and, all of this. I mean, just as a follow up to all of this. You talked about the meteorite. I did watch the video, and where you mentioned about a very old and very far away meteorite coming and smashing into somewhere in Scandinavia or wherever, and you've acquired that piece, and then you use that piece to basically, I think for the dial, or
Yeah.
that you were. I mean, where did the idea come from? Because at the end of the day, you need to have those ideas, and you need to know that I can go procure it and get it
Yeah.
fit into us. How did this come along?
Yeah. No, remember I said what I said at the start of the conversation. I'm a big space buff, right? And I mean, I don't know if it's relevant to this conversation. I believe in extraterrestrial life. I'm a big, I'm a believer of that, right? And I watch everything that has anything to do with extraterrestrial life, and be it documentaries, movies, books, you name it. I've seen it all. I've read it all. Pushing what we can do in terms of storytelling, and pushing what we can do in terms of the design of a watch, and giving the wearer simply joy to wear a product like that, is what we always aim for. And one of the ways we wanted to do it was to see if we can bring exotic materials into a space watch. And when we said space and exotic, the first thing that comes to our mind is a meteorite. The meteorites it's not completely uncommon. I mean, there are other watch brands that have done meteorite-based watches. We're not the first ones to do it, but we're clearly the first ones to do it in India, and we're clearly the first ones to do it as a tribute to the Indian space program in a watch in this form factor. So we started looking for it, and then we found contacts for meteorite hunters who go about hunting for meteorites. There are only two sources of meteorites in the world, two known sources. One is the Gibbon meteorite in Namibia, and the other is the Mu-Niona-Lusta meteorite in Scandinavia. Now, the Gibbon meteorite, the Namibian government has banned any exploration and mining in that area for the last few years. So anyone that's already got a hold of the Gibbon meteorite can hold on to it, but you can't do any more exploration there. Because of that, the rates of the Gibbon meteorites also exponential now. But the Mu-Niona-Lusta in Scandinavia is relatively common because Gibbon's more rare. The Mu-Niona-Lusta not as much. So we found meteorite hunters who were able to source this meteorite for us. So it goes through an entire process. It's one thing to get a chunk of meteorite rock and put it in your home, on your coffee table, if you will. But it's another thing to take it and put it inside a wristwatch. You have to think about a lot more things: engineering, construction. You also have to think about the durability of that meteorite. It's iron, it's nickel iron at the end of the day, so it's going to have to stick inside the watch dial and not oxidize, not rust, and not change form factor over the next 10, 15 years. So a lot of the thought went into that, a lot of engineering went into that process of sourcing, grading, cutting, engineering, and then the assembly process. But we're really proud of the outcome. We made 50 pieces as a limited edition, and we called that watch aptly extraterrestrial. And those 50 pieces have now all been reserved, and very soon they'll all be going to their respective owners, and we're really excited about that watch.
Yeah, I mean, fantastic, really terrific kind of work. I mean, I wonder, what is it? I mean, I am a space buff, and a lot of the listeners of this show are space buffs. But I'm sure that there's a lot of people out there who are not space buffs, who are really enthusiastic about a watch that is a tribute to the space, the space exploration and ISRO and others, right? Do you have a sense of who is your customer for this?
Absolutely. Look, I mean, we as I said, we've just celebrated our 3 years. About 70% of our owners are in India, about 30-35% are overseas. Our watches are with owners in over 35 countries now. So we absolutely have a good sense of who our owners are. And as you said, the owners of our watches come from two directions primarily. One direction is from where there is already a knowledge of watches. They probably already own a few Swiss watches. They understand what it means to own a Swiss watch and an automatic watch, and they understand and they like watches for the romance of owning an automatic watch with no batteries. So obviously that segment is gravitating towards a brand like ours, because we make respectable quality watches with the same high quality mechanism like a Swiss watch, but with Indian backstories. You also have owners coming in from the other end of the spectrum who are not watch people, but they gravitate towards the brand because of these interesting stories that we tell. Maybe there's somebody that likes the Indian Air Force, but has never found a way to appreciate or to celebrate the Indian Air Force until now, where we give them a watch to wear that celebrates the Indian Air Force. In the same way, there's a lot of space buffs now who have not found a way to now celebrate the Indian space program in this way. Now we give them a watch that they can wear forever, all the time on their wrist to celebrate this. So you have owners coming in from both these directions.
Right. Again, really interesting segmentation as well. I mean, that's what I would have assumed looking at this as well, right? Because essentially, I guess people need stories that they want to connect with, and they then connect to it, and then they really find that resonating with them as well. And in the process of all of this, I'm sure that you already mentioned that the extraterrestrial is already sold out, and you have the other Apogee series of watches, the three of them. What is it that when you compare yourself as an emerging brand out of India against somebody like an Omega who has flown watches to the moon and other places, and every astronaut in the US is wearing them in one way or the other, or in many other parts of the world as well? What are the aspirations that you have in comparison, let's say, or you see yourself getting to that level?
No, I think it's a great question. Look, we have global aspirations, if we have not already made it clear with the kind of products that we put out. We believe that we're building a world-class brand from India for the world. A lot of our owners from overseas are not even Indian people. They have, you have people from overseas that are gravitating towards the brand because they like the story we're telling. They like the passion with which we're building our products. It's like any independent brand that you gravitate towards. Why do people now like single origin coffee and not from a large coffee manufacturer? Why do we always pick a microbrewery for our beer as opposed to a large canned beer manufacturer? For the same reasons, there are people that gravitate towards small independent boutique watch brands like us as opposed to large watch manufacturers. We have huge aspirations ourselves. We'll look to associate our brand in any way possible, officially or unofficially, with any of these space programs if that's if that opportunity opens up. There's already some conversations ongoing that I may not be able to talk about openly, not just with the space program, but also with respect to our Air Force and aviation themed watches, where doors have opened for us to go and have more associations, with aviation in the aviation industry. So we have global aspirations, and clearly that's been the case from day one.
Right, and if you would imagine a future, connecting all of this space and watches and so on, what are your aspirations in terms of where do you want to be with all of this? Do you want to see, one of the things that I clearly can see for you is there is an upcoming Gaganyaan mission where, there'll be Indian astronauts flying. I hope they wear one of your watches.
Look, if that happens, that'll be fantastic, right? We aspire to something like that. We know that it's also an uphill task to having our watches being worn by civilians versus being worn in multiple G forces and several thousand kilometers of velocity going around the planet. But if something like that opens up, we're confident that we'd take it up in our chin and execute.
What are the challenges like? Let's say I am the ISRO chief. Let's just assume that I'm the ISRO chief, and I come to you and say, okay, I really want my guys to come up and say that they're wearing a Indian-made watch on orbit, and I want that to work. So is that something that easily scales towards making sure that the QC for all of that is then there?
Yeah, no, look, I mean, from a technical standpoint, there's nothing that stops our watches from being worn in space, right? Be it a battery-operated quartz watch or a mechanically operated watch like one of ours. Technically, nothing stops from those watches being worn in space. You'd be there was a recent story about what was the watch that Wing Commander Rakesh Sharma was wearing during one of his during his salute mission in the 80s, and turns out that it was a quartz watch. It was not an automatic watch. It was not the Omega Moon watch that has usually the first watch that comes to people's mind. It was a very understated, thin, small, tiny watch that you wouldn't think has gone to space. And I am familiar with this matter from a first person's point of view. And I don't believe that watch went through any specific tests in order to qualify to be flight ready, if you will. So in theory, nothing stops any of our watches from being worn in space. However, I do believe that the build quality of a watch has to be solid. You can't just have a watch falling apart when it goes to space, especially when it's exposed to shocks. I don't believe that anti-magnetic rating is as important, because I don't believe that you'll have strong magnetic fields inside the cockpit of if you have a capsule or a module rather. But I do think that shock proof is important, and how accurate it is important. And is it just reliable? Does it just fall off an astronaut's wrist when you're taking off at 40,000 kilometers an hour? So reliability is key, and I don't believe that it's a huge challenge to achieve that. It'll be a very challenging project for us personally, because we're extremely passionate about this and space. But technically, it's not a big challenge for where we are right now to get to a point like that.
Right, and one of the other dimensions that are up and coming nowadays is a lot of brands using space to enhance the value of the product. So, for example, I know a French company that takes wines to space, and they develop some enzyme there that has only been, it can only grow in space, and then they kind of say, okay, now this is really produced, matured in space, and they bring it back and they sell it at tens and thousands of dollars, right? So there are consumers there who really want that, right? So, and then there's other people who are looking at other things. There are pharmaceutical companies looking at using microgravity in space to produce certain enzymes or reactions and things like that. And they say, okay, if we manufacture this in a microgravity setting, there may be better technology, better products that come out of all of this, right? I wonder if there's something like that for watches.
Absolutely. I mean, you hit it right on the head. Microgravity has been used as a marketing tool for a long time with watches. I mean, if you look at Omega, for example, I mean, I have huge respect for what the Speedmaster program has been able to do with the NASA, the Apollo missions specifically. But if you look at that story, that same story is being used in Omega's marketing for 60 years now, almost. And there are many watch brands after Omega that came up and found opportunities to send their watches to space, and if not really to space, at least to above the stratosphere, which is technically space, and brought the watch back and marketed it as a watch that's been to space. It's already been done before, but there's nothing like having one of the watches worn by an active mission astronaut. So that's always going to set a high bar.
Right. And do you see an audience for, let's say, watches that have gone to space and have come back, and even within India in that sense?
Oh, totally. Yes, absolutely. I mean, look, if the enthusiasm for our extraterrestrial watch was any indication, I definitely think that there is people that be interested to go buy a watch that has gone to space in some way, shape, or form.
Great. I mean, that's really interesting, because there are lots of companies that are today flying satellites, and I'm sure that there's some of them who might even say, I want to take some watches, get to space and then get back there for a certain amount of time. How much of a effect does, let's say, radiation or thermal cycling have on such watches?
Whoa. Okay. Now that's probably above my pay grade in terms of technology to answer. But I'll tell you, I'll take an educated guess. Let's take watches powered by quartz crystals, which is what we call battery watches. They're powered by quartz crystals. And then watches like the Apogee that are powered by mechanical movements. Both these categories of watches have a threshold for low temperature and high temperature. Room temperatures at 23, 24 degrees. And I believe they operate, they're tested to operate normally up until 45 degrees on the high side and up until probably like 4 degrees on the low side. So anytime you have thermal variance beyond these thresholds, watches are known to not perform as well. And you have to test them and you have to build them and engineer them and construct them in a way that the temperature fluctuations are not going to affect them. Now, about radiation's effect on watches, I don't believe radiation has any effect on watches because if it did, we would have known by now. There's been many watches that went to space. The watches that went to the moon, I don't believe radiation has an effect, at least in terms of timekeeping and the accuracy of the function of a watch.
Yeah, I guess that's because they're purely like mechanical driven, mechanism driven. They don't have any electronic elements that upset, electronics behind it, I suppose.
Well, there's been electronic watches that's gone to space as well. Let's take a Casio G-Shock, for instance, right? It's the invincible watch. You put it under an 18-wheel truck, nothing happens to it. These are great watches. And I know that these Casio digital watches have been to space. I don't believe that radiation has an impact on them as much as shock, velocity, or temperature variances, for instance, would have, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely interesting. I mean, also given that most watches are worn by people and, they are inside of a capsule normally, and the exposure time is not normally more than for a number of years because normally radiation takes time to kind of, collect, I would say.
That's true. But even when you're doing a spacewalk, there are watches that are worn during extravehicular activities, and there is no negative impact because of radiation. These watches function perfectly normally.
Great. So you've put out the 4 watches and the space theme is out. Where's the space theme heading?
Well, ironically, we've been around for 3 years and 2 of those in Corona years. So a lot of what we wanted to do, we've never been able to do. Right now, the mandate for my team right now is to get the watches out as much as possible and get as many people to know about the brand as possible, because we're still operating at a fraction of a budget as when compared to a large watch brand. We're self-funded at the moment. My wife Mercy and I, we invested a majority of our life savings into the project. And we do not have the deep marketing pockets like some of the large brands. So at least for the immediate future, when things start settling down in terms of social distancing and social gatherings, we'll be looking forward to taking the watches out and going out to as many people as possible.
Yeah, good luck with that. And I hope that, this is a stepping stone to having more such space, theme watches as such.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, as far as our plans go, there is no end to the imagination. We pushed ourselves and we even called it the Apogee because this is the farthest we've gone so far. But I do not believe that this is the end. We'll be raising our orbit as we go. We'll be firing thrusters at set intervals to raise orbits higher and higher as we go. And this isn't the end. And I also hope truly that more brands like us, not just in watches, in anything for that matter, come up and tell more space stories. We want more people. I think the end goal is we want more people to look up, stop looking down on the phones, look up at the sky and ask the big questions. And if it happens through watches or shoes or computers or pens or cars or whatnot, I think we'll be happy that happens.
What can people do to support you who are from my industry, which is the space industry, either locally with the agency or with the private sector or so on?
I mean, the first thing that people can do to support us is to go check us out. If you have any inclination in social media, give us a follow and tell your friends. We've grown in the last 3 years mainly due to word of mouth. We have very minimal marketing budgets, and if you're into watches, it's fantastic. Check out our watches. With our team's more than happy to help. If you're not into watches, still check us out. Maybe this may be your first watch after a long time that you've worn because there's an interesting story. So the best thing that people can do is check us out and tell your friends.
Yeah, always. Thanks again. Maybe one last final question before we wrap up. Where do you see yourself in 10 years' time?
Wow, that's a long time. Where do we see ourselves in 10 years' time? I'll tell you where we don't want to see ourselves. That we're clear. I think a lot of people ask me, okay, where do you see yourself? And oftentimes I tell them that I know where I don't want to be. If you know that, that's half the bridge crossed. At least you're looking at the right direction. So just putting things in perspective, Titan Industries, which is one of the largest watch manufacturers in the world, and a large watch manufacturer in India, they produce 15 million watches a year. Bangalore Watch Company today produces 1,000 watches a year. So we're a drop in the ocean when compared to the large watch manufacturers. Even Swatch Group produces more than 15 million watches a year. We're a very small company compared to that. I think one thing that we wanted to do was to identify ourselves as the first luxury watch brand from India, built from India for the world. And I do believe it'll be a fair statement to say that there's already that identifier with Bangalore Watch Company. We've been recognized by everybody in the watch industry. If we're able to continue to tell more inspiring stories from India, and if we're able to inspire more people to look at watches because of these stories, I think that's where we'd like to be a few years from now. If you may not be a watch person, you may not come to us because you're a watch person, but you come to us because one of the stories we tell is inspiring to you. That's a win. And if we have 20, 30, 40,000 of those people coming to us every year, 10 years from now, that's a win.
Great. I'll leave the links to your Apogee video,
please,
as well as the social media in the transcripts of this, the show notes of the episode. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to coming and meeting me in person, and then taking the time in recording this particular episode. I'd love to keep in touch. And of course, if I'm running any space event in Bangalore, I'd love to invite you to come and present the Apogee as well.
We'd love to do that. Look, we speak with a lot of watch publications. I've spoken a lot of watch podcasts. I spend a lot of time with the people in the watch industry and the luxury industry. It feels amazing to have the Apogee conversation with a group of people in a community that understands space for a change. So I really enjoyed this conversation. A lot of these questions were very relevant. As I said, space is close to my heart. So I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for having me here.